Politics knows that when there's an
welcome to Shaka Extra Time. I am Paul Ndiho. Joining me on set is Shaka Ssali himself, aka the Kabale Kid. Hello, Shaka.
Hello, Paul.
How are you?
I have to say that I remain simple, easy, and awesome.
Well, thank you. A warm welcome to you all. Our Facebook followers are watching us live. Shaka Extra Time is a show that comes to you every Tuesday. And today we'll be talking about a wider range of issues. And let's start here in Washington. There is a lot, Shaka, there is a lot of talk on Capitol Hill in regard to the possible impeachment of a sitting president here in the United States. How likely is that maybe likely to happen, or is it something that could spark off a whole, maybe like, let's say, like some people have called it, a revolution here in the United States?
I don't think really that it will go to the extent of a revolution, but it is something that could just be done because you have to pretty much follow the Constitution. The founding fathers, made this incredible document, a document that was a reflection of their new country becoming a republic, not a kingdom, not a monarchy, because in fact they rebelled against that type of culture, that kind of political culture. And so they made sure that the President of the United States was not going to be a king, was not going to be a monarch. He was, or she was, going to be a servant of the people.
But when you look in terms of significance, how big is this? We've had situations whereby former President Bill Clinton was impeached, but when it went to the Senate, he was actually exonerated. Could we see a scenario where Democrats push for an impeachment of President Trump, but then it gets to the Senate and it's stalled?
Paul, it is not about politics. It's about the Constitution. And the House of Representatives, which obviously happens as we talk, happens to be controlled by the Democratic Party. It has a constitutional obligation, a mandate, that of oversight. It is the kind of thing that has to be done in the large or broad political context of what makes this country tick. You're talking about checks and balances. And so the House of Representatives has the responsibility of oversight as far as the White House is concerned. And they are following the law. Whether or not the Senate, which is controlled by the Republicans, eventually tries the president, is another matter. But the House of Representatives has a mandate, it has an obligation, essentially, to set the ball rolling. That is what the Constitution requires them to do. And mind you, when you start, when you look at some of the public opinion polls already, for some reason, they seem to be leaning towards impeachment. As a matter of fact, there are other public opinion polls which are even going further than simply impeachment, removal from office. And by the way, you talk about impeachment. You talk about, for example, Bill Clinton, who obviously was impeached by the House of Representatives and eventually could not be, in a sense, convicted by the Senate. But when you look at the different types of violations that are involved here, this one seems to be huge. This one seems to be something about what you would call a violation of vital national security interests.
Can I push back a little bit? You talked about it's not about politics, but rather the constitution and the law. And as we speak, if it was not just about politics, some Republicans would have jumped on board maybe to push further. But in this particular case, we're only seeing Democrats who are calling for this trial to go forward.
You are right. To a certain degree, yes, there is politics or the political elements involved, but at the end of the day, this is about the Constitution.
And how about people who said that perhaps this is got you? They are looking for ways to go after the Mueller report didn't produce any results, significant results. They say, hey, we are still looking for a way to go after the president.
The Mueller report did produce results. He may have been expected, for example, to eventually make a sort of judgment call, talking namely that there was obstruction, for example, of justice, that there was collusion, especially when it talks about the issue of the Russian involvement and what have you. But let's face it, especially, Mueller, what he did, he basically wrote a report and essentially forwarded it to the Congress, to Capitol Hill, for them to do their part. And frankly, I have been following the debates that are going on. It looks like there is a sort of consensus that says that if you looked at the Mueller report itself, you could probably get sufficient language that would provide you an opportunity to invoke certain articles of impeachment. I'm not a lawyer, by the way. I never went to law school, so I'm not going deep into that. But from what I have seen, it seems to me that from what I have been hearing in terms of the political pundits, some of the legislators, it seems to me that you could actually very well be talking about something akin to a smoking gun. You're talking about the telephone call between the President of the United States and the President of Ukraine. And by the way, you saw that the committees responsible for bringing about these articles of impeachment, they have actually subpoenaed the man called Rudy Giuliani, America's mayor, a man who was a very successful mayor of New York City for a very long time, who happens to be a lawyer and is a personal lawyer for President Donald Trump. He's been subpoenaed because he has actually been talking a lot, and in the process contradicting himself and what have you. And so he has actually been subpoenaed to bring certain documents so that they could look at it and see where those documents can take them. You also have seen that the Secretary of State, Mr. Pompeo, has also been subpoenaed. And in fact, in talking to some journalists, he seemed to give the impression that he didn't know much about that apparent telephone call between the President of the United States and the President of Ukraine. And yet, there is incontrovertible evidence, not liable to falter for, that in fact he happened to be one of those individuals who was listening in while that conversation between the two presidents was going on.
Let's tie this impeachment inquiry to Africa in the context of Africa. Can an African leader be impeached under the circumstances given or presented by the Democrats so far, especially in light of where African leaders have a lot of power? Something like an impeachment like this or a trial like this would not even happen.
You'll be surprised. Yes, there are some countries on the African continent where that or something very close to that actually could happen or has happened. Not the entire African continent. And let's face it, our audience should be cognizant of the fact that Africa is not a country like the United States of America is a country. Africa is a continent that is made up of at least 54 member countries of the African Union, plus Western Sahara, 55. Now, when you look at South Africa, for example, I know that you know as well as I do that in its history of an inclusive democracy since 1994, when the Madiba, the late President Nelson Mandela, became the first black president of the Republic of South Africa, in an election that was for the first time an inclusive election. They called it all-race election. You have had two presidents who have actually been recalled from their presidency. You recently had Mushorozi, Jacob Zuma. That is pretty much tantamount to impeachment, really. You also had Thabo Mbeki. Thabo Mbeki had actually been also recalled. So what do you call that? That could happen.
But you're looking at a country like South Africa that has a very, very liberal constitution, and where actually the law is the rule of the land rather than the opposite.
It is true that South Africa has an incredible liberal document that is called Constitution. It is also equally true that they have inbuilt checks and balances. You have an independent judiciary in South Africa. You also, of course, the records will show that you have an independent legislature. In fact, even the ruling party itself, the African National Congress, it can be said that it is democratic itself, because without actually that element of democracy, it would not have, South Africa would not have been able to recall those two presidents, who at the same time happened also to be presidents of the ruling African National Congress. South Africa also, unlike a lot of African countries, has what you would call an independent fourth estate. We are talking about the media. And those are very, very important factors.
Speaking about democratic institutions, let's go to Mahomes Charles. Do you think African states can ever become democratic without the intervention of the West and America?
Yes, of course they can. There are some, legitimate democratic institutions within certain countries on the African continent. We have to accept the fact that South Africa is a legitimate a country that is in fact run on legitimate democratic principles. I don't think that it does so simply because it is being told by Washington or being told by London or by Paris. You look at a country like Mauritius. Mauritius has, essentially a democratic political culture. You look at Botswana. It has a legitimate political culture.
But one could argue that in Botswana, it's not as political as it's maybe political at the top, but in terms of regular also the other politics, it still remains the same. It's predominantly dominated by one political party.
It is true, but then again, my brother, you probably also have to be reminded of the fact that historically, at one time, Japan was dominated by one political party, and no one raised the issue of whether or not Japan was not in fact being ruled on democratic principles. So democracy is democracy. Democracy is an equal opportunity employer, no matter how it comes on the table, on the radar.
Let's go to another interesting comment here, rather question from Uganda. Leso Kawomera Arafa. Mr. Shaka, what's your take on the Uganda People's Defense Forces Barrett? I mean, I think they're talking about opposition leader here, Bobby Wine, whose slogan is People Power, and his supporters were the Red Berets.
Well, first of all, I am reasonably informed that the law gives the government, I think, the right, for example, to deny a civil organization to wear something akin to a military uniform. I was in the army at one time, and I was a paratrooper, and I happen to know that historically, the red, berets, usually a reflection of an institution called paracommandos, those types of people, special army groups and all that kind of stuff. I think that Bobby Wine has to decide whether his struggle is either going to be an armed struggle, just like the man he is struggling against, Yoweri Kaguta Museveni. He basically got into State House via. He had the dubious privilege or luxury of putting on any type of fatigues or any type of belays that he wished to do, because he was pretty much operating at that time. And so if Bobby Wine wants to struggle in a political sense or context, he has to make sure that he does that within the law of the day. He may not like the law, but unfortunately, he has to respect the manner in which the laws of the land have been put together, at least for now. And he really can do it, because what he needs to do is to make sure that he basically mobilizes and organizes within the law, and organizes and mobilizes around these ideas that demand the presence of social, economic, political justice for all.
You brought up a very interesting point, Shaka. You talked about mobilizing and organizing. Here in the 1960s, the right Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. Organized the black people, the Jews, and everybody rallied behind him. He did not necessarily have to wear a uniform, as opposed to like the Black Panthers, for example. So can opposition leaders or young people who are trying to challenge the status quo maybe borrow that approach?
Oh yes, you can borrow that approach, because as a matter of fact, when you see Bobby Wine, adopting the red beret, it's not because it's a new initiative. It's not because he is trying to reinvent the wheel. He's probably borrowing that idea historically from probably young Che Guevara. Che Guevara used to put on a beret. I don't remember precisely whether the color was red. It probably may have been black or whatever.
Red.
And then you know that there is also Hugo Chavez, a former paratrooper, by the way. He was a former paratrooper in the regular army. Julius Malema in South Africa. Yeah, so he may actually be borrowing from those types of experiences. He should, I think, perhaps heed what you just talked about. Borrow from the examples of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s armies. His armies did not have red berets. They did not have AK-47s. They had ideas. They worked around ideas. And these ideas were reflections really, of the absence of socio-economic political justice. And they won, despite the Jim Crow, for example, that obtained in society, especially in the southern part of the United States, which, by the way, was the equivalent of what was apartheid in South Africa. You heard recently a people power or a revolution in Khartoum, in South Africa, in Sudan. I did not see any red berets there. In fact, the leadership of that particular revolution should in fact be attributed to the gallant women of Sudan. They were able, however, to respect everybody who felt that he or she wanted to be part of that movement. And they were able to work together with some elements within the armed forces. This is where, in fact, Bobi Wine really needs to also be very careful about alienating, for example, the armed forces of Uganda. Because the armed forces, when you look at the soldiers and officers of the Ugandan army, just like any other army anywhere around the world, they are not basically homogeneous. They are heterogeneous. They are people who think differently, and they think in a manner that reflects sometimes their socioeconomic class, or in terms of their culture, in terms of their relatives. They are soldiers who are suffering as much as those other civilians within the Ugandan context. So he should actually be looking at an army composed of those people who do not have. He should look at Uganda in the context of those who have, and those are very, very few, by the way, and those who do not have.
Let's stay in Uganda. Let's go to Nyiramanzi Patrick. Good evening, Mzee Shaka Ssali and Kijana Ndiho. Could you please explain to us why this Uganda-Rwanda relationship is unpredictable and volatile?
First of all, I would like to address my sister initially by saying that I really happen to be eminently underqualified.
And I think it's a he.
Nyiramanzi.
Nyiramanzi Patrick.
Okay, Patrick, yeah. I would like to tell Patrick that I find myself eminently underqualified to be Mzee.
Well, the word Mzee is respectful, and I'm sure they are looking at it from that perspective.
Yes.
It's a title that is bestowed on any elder.
An elder?
Yes.
Okay, I understand. What was the question again?
The question was, why is the situation between Uganda and Rwanda very unpredictable and volatile?
First of all, to be very honest with you, Patrick, I think your guess is probably as good as mine. But all I can say is, I think it involves two individuals here. It's not about the millions of people on either side of the border. It is the two people who happen to occupy those sensitive leadership positions. And I would like to say, given that the two are basically democratically challenged in their different ways, they are probably people that we should look at as rulers. They do not have the mandate of their people. They have, therefore, so much probably dependent on their political egos and all that kind of stuff. And these are two people, by the way, who really went through armed struggle fighting against what they called dictatorships. People who clearly were not democratic. At that time, I have to say that they had the right to do whatever they did in order to make it very difficult for those rulers they were fighting against. Unfortunately, what has since happened is that they too have not really done what you would say is a social, cultural, political improvement over the management of their two respective countries. I think that when you think about the fact that they fought the governments, and they reached a point where there were some kind of political stalemate. And I remember in particular, when it comes to Uganda, you're talking about 1985. 1985, I happened to be in Dar es Salaam, the commercial capital of Tanzania. I was a PhD student from UCLA, University of California, Los Angeles, a Ford Foundation scholar, and I was doing my research associated with the Tanzania Film Company. Erimboto, who was the guy that managed it and was my supervisor. And I was also partly functioning at what they call... I remember that Yoweri Museveni, the leader of the NRIM, was undergoing negotiations in Nairobi under the auspices of the then president of Kenya, Daniel Toroitich Arap Moi. They actually signed the deal, but guess what? That deal was not worth the pen that was used to sign it. They call them peace jokes.
Yeah, interesting. Let's go to another comment here. Let's first talk about a Ugandan journalist, Solomon Serwanja, recently won a prestigious award, the Komla Award, offered by or given by the BBC. You've met Solomon, a remarkable young journalist in Uganda. What do you have to say about that?
Not only have I met him, but you remember that you and I had the privilege of taking him for Nyama Choma.
In fact, I worked on a documentary with him.
That's his joint. That's right. In fact, that is when they were working on the documentary involving, I think...
Alfred Olango, the Ugandan who was killed in
San Diego. Yeah. I think congratulations really to him. It is very interesting that that award, which was, by the way, launched, if I remember correctly, in 2014, in honor of Komla Dumo, who was actually my friend. I first had an interview with him in the Ghanaian capital of Accra. In fact, he interviewed me on Joy FM radio. Komla died of a heart attack, and it was very, very good, very effective. And the BBC decided rightly to honor him by having that type of award so that some other African journalists could take advantage of that to show their talent. So far, there are 5 recipients of those, and out of that, you have 2 Ugandans. Nancy Kashunjira was the first person from Uganda to win it, and she's now a legitimate journalist with the BBC. And so now you have Solomon. So maybe there is something journalistically good in the soil of Uganda. Yeah.
In 30 seconds, any final thoughts about inspiring young journalists?
Really is to identify what they want. Once you identify what you want, you get the appropriate tools to help you navigate and negotiate your way to wherever you want to go. And once you do, you have to focus like a laser beam. You have to work harder, jump higher, you have to run faster so that you can do it.
Well, on that note, thank you so much for being a great guest. I look forward to hosting you on another edition of Shaka Extra Time. Until then, so long from Washington. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much with that incredibly gorgeous shot.
Thank you, Shaka.
You're most welcome.